Hello guys and welcome to Channel X24. Today we're going to be taking a look at the build process of this plywood catamaran that you can see on the water behind me. Now if you haven't checked out my boat build project introduction video, go and check that out now, links here and in the description. Now let's see how we take some sheets of ply and turn them into a boat that floats. This boat was constructed using a technique called stitch and glue. The different faces of the boat's hull are cut from plywood and then stitched together with zip ties or twisted wire. The seam line is pre-saturated with epoxy, a fillet of thickened epoxy is applied along the length, and fiberglass tape applied along the top. This boat uses the simplest form of this construction, with only two faces, forming a deep V hull. As this boat was a prototype, I didn't have the exact measurements for the size of each face, so I tried to get as big a hull as I could from the plywood sheets. I didn't use marine grade plywood for this construction. Instead, I used sheathing ply. Next time, I would use marine grade ply to extend the lifespan of the boat. I used a jigsaw to cut the hull shapes from the ply. I then built frames that were secured onto the plywood to keep the hulls in shape. These add strength to the hulls and give a surface for fixing the deck to. Once the hulls were stitched together, I can mock up how the boat would look. Next I worked on adding additional rigidity to the hulls. Here I added a plywood strip to the inside, but in the end I opted for oak strips that were screwed and glued into place. I used cardboard to create templates for bulkheads and then used a thick mix of epoxy and sawdust to glue them in place. This is where plans would be useful, as precision fitting bulkheads would save a lot of epoxy. I added holes for small screw lock hatches in the center of the bulkheads. On reflection, these serve little function, but they look like they do, and they look cool, so yeah. I then wanted to make the boat longer, so I built stern sections which were glued and bolted into place. Building in parts like this made the build easier in a confined space, but time and material could be saved by scarf jointing ply to create a long continuous hull. Because of this joining along the bulkheads, each hull has 4 separate sections, which makes the boat safer. Sections like the back that aren't used for stowage could be filled with foam to further increase the safety of the boat. The insides of the hulls were now coated in epoxy, followed by layers of marine grade paint. Make sure you shop around for your paint, as the big brands are often very expensive. After this, the top deck section was cut, the underside epoxied and painted, and then screwed and glued into the hull. I used a router to create a nice fillet along the sides, and filled the gaps with thickened epoxy. Epoxy is very versatile, and can be used for coating, laminating, and gluing. In this project, I mixed up epoxy composites from sawdust, caulk, and microfibers. I used microfibers when a lot of strength was required. I also used polyester resin for gap filling to save epoxy, as it's much cheaper. It's very important to always wear nitrile gloves when handling epoxy and other resins, and wear a respirator with organic vapor filters. Use a respirator when sanding as well. Due to the way the hull sections joined, I had to create a keel on the hulls, so weight would be distributed evenly when the boat was beached. To do this, I stretched string along the bottom of the hulls and measured offsets that I transferred onto wood to cut out the shape. The keel was then screwed, and thickened epoxy and polyester used to refine the shape. The keel was then rounded and sanded, and 3 layers of woven fiberglass laminated along its length to make it very strong. Apart from the hulls, a core part of a catamaran is the beams that will hold them together. I used CAD software to design beams that could be made from laminated 25 by 50mm timber and ply. The ply face sections of each beam could be cut out of one sheet of ply with no scarfing. To add aesthetic flair and lift the deck higher above the water, the beams have a stepped up design. The beams attached to the hull via bolts, slotting into wooden beam mounts. The beam mounts had to be very strong, so the sides and insides of each mount have a laminated fiberglass. The beams were constructed by gluing and clamping the 25 by 50mm timbers together and then laminating and screwing the plywood to the timber. Like all the wood on the boat, the beams were coated in epoxy and painted. When working with epoxy, it's important to be aware of amine blush that forms on the surface of the resin. This blush is tacky and will clog up sandpaper. The amine must be removed before sanding. I used warm soapy water and a scouring pad to clean the surface before sanding. I'm painting the boat and beams with a gloss polyurethane single-part paint. In future, I'd attach the beams to the boat differently, likely opting for lashing as is used on Wareham catamarans. For one hull, I built my own hatches with simple 3D printed rotating latches to keep them closed. To save time on the other hull, I purchased polymer hatches that have the benefit of being able to be walked on. These commercial hatches don't seem to be designed to be mounted horizontally, as they do let in water, so building your own might be a better option if you want watertight stowage areas. The hulls were coated with epoxy and sheathed with a layer of woven fiberglass. After cleaning the amine off, they were sanded and roller painted with 3 layers of polyurethane paint. I created a motor mount by laminating pine boards together with fiberglass reinforced brackets. This bolted onto the stern beam mounts and latched onto the hulls at the sides. For the deck, I used a large diamond plate polymer sheet that I found washed up on the shore. Steel guttering pipes with wooden end caps were added across the beams. These are aligned in position with 3D printed brackets. The polymer sheet has a wooden frame that holds the pipes captive and lashes to the boat's beams. Stainless cleats were added to the bow and stern of each hull. I was able to through-bolt the front cleats, but for the rear I didn't have access underneath. The solution was to 3D print a base for the cleat, complete with Seablade branding of course, that allows it to be screwed in place. Finally, to protect the keels when beaching the boat, I cut sections of ABS gutter to fit in a small oven. These were heated and then formed over the keels. 3M double-sided tape was then used to attach them to the keels. I used the VHB 4952 tape, as this is designed for sticking to low surface energy plastics. And with that, the boat was complete. There was a nerve-wracking trailer ride down to the shore that saw one of the hulls fall off and suffer some minor damage, but some epoxy and duct tape sorted the issue. The boat was assembled down by the shore, and well, it floats.